end of the book, and we want to look there at a couple of things. So just as a preview of where we're going, so you can focus in on your readings for this. When we look at the last chapter of the book, it starts off with this kind of amazing flourish that Hegel will do sometimes, where he just sort of stands back and says, "Now here's what we've achieved." Right? He doesn't go back and do a rehearsal like he does sometimes of the whole argument that he's made in the book, but he does give you sort of, here's what we've achieved, this kind of monumental thing. And he uses all these flourishes for it. We'll talk a little bit about that at the end of today if we stay on track. But then he goes and says, well, we're talking about the logicality of that. We're talking about the method of that. So then he lays out the method from there. As I mentioned last time, I think most people read that and are kind of read it as anticlimactic, right? Because you made all this progress towards this concept and the idea from that, and then at the end of it, you've gotten a lot before it, right? You've got a lot of leading up to it, is a claim about how everything must be understood in terms of beginning, progression, and end, right? So this kind of basic notion of what methodology is at that point. But that methodology has been won, so to speak. It's been established now because of the movement of the concept of what it is and how that operates. So we'll talk about that next week. But then one of the things that's always very tantalizing, very significant about that last chapter is the last couple of pages where Hegel makes the transition, or at least announces the transition. We'll argue about what the nature of it is, into the rest of the system, and in particular into nature. Right, so we move from idea into nature, and so there's a lot of things to be done there. So I'll focus a little bit on that week or the week thereafter. So be aware that we'll talk a little bit about that. We won't, by any stretch of the imagination, solve any of those issues, but we'll at least think about how the logic relates to the rest of the system. The logic relates specifically to the Naturphilosophie, the philosophy of nature. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Then from there, the final week that we meet, March 11th, we'll be talking about the preface to the second edition. So this is where we have this really odd text where Hegel is looking back at something he finished in 1816, really, and he's going back and revising it for a second edition. We actually read the Doctrine of Being. The version of the Doctrine of Being that we read was that revised version of that, because that's what gets translated, rather than the 1812 edition. You get the 1830-31 edition of that in this translation. That's where Hegel's fixing language and whatnot. We'll talk about some of that when we get there. But in the preface, he famously says, he makes a claim about language. Right? And so this is in 1831. This is the last year of his life. He dies a week after writing this text. And so it's worth taking a look at that for a number of reasons. There's a ton of stuff there, but we'll look at it in terms of the lingering question of language and how that relates to the critiques of panlogicism that we've seen, both in terms of the ineffable and in terms of the which is non-intelligible. So we'll talk about that then. So just preview of where we're headed, what's coming up, that's where we're going. All right, I know most of you at this point have talked to me about papers. Good. Those of you who haven't, you can see me if you need to. I'll be glad to talk with you about topics and papers and make some recommendations for you for secondary literature, which is required for this one, not for the first one, but required for this. Questions, problems, or issues? Thanks. So I want to come back to this question of truth. I set it aside last week because I wanted to make sure we made it through the account of life, logical life, and I do want to come back to that as well, because it's obviously related, but I wanted to set it aside, the problem of truth, last week, to make sure we made it through logical life and what is logical life as opposed to natural life and spiritual life. We will come back to those issues as well. But I want to come back to the question of truth and begin there and focus in on that and ask the question. It's a really quite simple question in a lot of ways. What does it mean to say that the idea is the truth of all things? That's the claim he's making. The idea, the adequate concept, is the truth of all things. What kind of truth are we talking about? What does it mean to say it's the truth of all things? It's all things in their truth, the way he also sometimes will express it. So what is that conception of truth at work, operative in those passages? What does it really mean? What does it look like? So I want to try to figure that out a little bit. So let me just try to work through some of those passages a little bit, and some of the stuff will be familiar, some of it won't. But let me try to set it up that way, and then that'll lead us into discussion about life again, and then ultimately into cognition, which is where we'll spend most of our time today. So I want to begin today then by focusing on the question that Hegel reminds us stands at the very core of the subjective logic, that is the question of truth. One of the ways of characterizing, the difference between the objective logic and the subjective logic, so the doctrine of being in essence, objective logic, and the doctrine of the concept, subjective logic. One of the ways of characterizing that distinction is that the former, that is the objective logic, is focused on the question, what is being? What is it to be? And the answer to that question, as we saw, was that being is fundamentally actuality. That's the last determination of being, the objective logic. Excuse me. Where actuality is understood to be nothing other than the self-generative, that is the causative process, and once necessary and free, that is the concept, right? So there's the claim that ultimately actuality just is what the concept produces. So the question at the core of the subjective logic then is a related question, but it's a distinct question from what is being. It is, and I apologize because this sounds massively Heideggerian, and I don't mean it to sound massively Heideggerian, although we'll be back to use Heidegger as a reference point in just a moment. I would say you could say that the subjective logic then, not the objective logic. The objective logic is addressing the question, what is being? You could say that the whole of the logic is addressing that question, right? So I'm not against framing it that way. But the objective logic really is trying to give you an account of what is being. Being is actuality. What is actuality? Actuality is the result of a process known as the concept. So what is the doctrine of the concept's fundamental question? Well, it's the question, what is the truth? What is truth? What is the truth of being? So because Hegel insists that the concept must be understood as freedom, then another way of putting that same question, what is the truth of being, would be how to think truth as freedom. That doesn't seem right. That doesn't seem like they go together, right? Truth is not about anything like freedom. I mean, they're both noble concepts, right? They're noble ideas. We ought to aspire to both of them, right? Platitudes we can say, but to put the two together really doesn't make any sense, right? So why do we do that? So how to think truth as freedom, but I think that this is precisely what Hegel's asking us to do. If you look at pages, really, he does this in several places, but let me just give you one set of checks. I'm not going to go through these in detail, but this is what he is saying at 521. Take a look at 521. We've been here several times. We'll come back here more, sorry. But on 521, he says there, I'm looking at 521, this is page 23 in the German. He says in the very first paragraph down on page 521, directly connected with this is the issue of how to view the concept and the character of logic generally. The issue, namely, of the relation of the concept and its science to truth itself. So what's the relationship between the concept as a science of the concept and the logic and truth itself? He says, this is an issue on which the Kantian philosophy holds the same position as is commonly taken. So let's take Kant as representative of the kind of commonsensical, normal way, traditional, conventional way of understanding this relationship. He says, we cited earlier from Kant's deductions. This is all, in the polemical, preliminary stuff. It's not in the scientific deduction stuff. So he says, we cited earlier from Kant's deduction of the categories to the effect that, according to it, the object in which the manifold of intuition is unified is this unity only by virtue of the unity of self-consciousness. So that's the apperception thesis out of the first critique of the B deduction. The objectivity of thought is here, therefore, specifically defined. It is the identity of concept and thing, which is the truth. Concept and thing, which is the truth. In the same way, it is also commonly accepted Kant's a representative of the common conception. As thought appropriates a given subject matter, this subject matter thereby undergoes an alteration, is made from something sensuous into something thought. So when you have the truth of something, you think it, right? So truth is a matter of applying a concept to an object, and you get it right or not. It's what Hegel calls, before Heidegger started calling it this, correctness. Right? It's about the concept is appropriately capturing the thing itself. It's also what you could say is a propositional theory of truth, because what you're doing with the concept is not applying the concept directly. You're saying this book is black, right? this folder is black, this notebook is black. Well, that's an application of a concept to a thing, right? So that's the standard view of what truth is. It's propositional. It's the relationship between a claim you're making, which contains a concept within it, but it contains it as predicated of something. In this case, this notebook is black, and you're predicating black of the notebook. So it's the application of a concept to a thing through predication, through proposition. He says, dropping down now about halfway through that paragraph, but on the other hand, it is also equally claimed that we cannot know things as they are in and for themselves. This is Kant again, and we don't know things as they are themselves. And that truth is inaccessible to rational cognition. And so we can't really know if our ascriptions are true, because that's stuff out there that we are always aspiring to get right? To the correctness of our judgments is always aspirational. We're always trying to get the truth right, but we're always coming to go back and check, right? We have what you could call a kind of pragmatic theory of truth. You're always constantly making ascriptions, making assessments of things, but you're always recognizing, I may have got that wrong. I need to constantly go back and check it, make sure, ascribe it again, check and see if it's, I need intersubjective verification, all this kind of wonderful stuff we can do with it. But on the other hand, it is also equally claimed that we cannot know things as they are in and for themselves, and that truth is inaccessible to rational cognition. That the aforesaid truth that would consist in the unity of the object and the concept is in fact only appearance, phenomenal. Again, on the ground now that the content is only the manifold of intuition, all we're getting in is what comes in through sensibility. But we have just remarked regarding this point that it is precisely in the concept that the manifold is sublated in as much as it pertains to intuition as opposed to the concept. And that through the concept, notice Hegel's loading it back into the concept. He's saying what's the commonsensical notion is you're trying to apply concepts to things. In this case, objects of intuition, sensitive intuition. And he thinks, concept, the best philosophical representative of that common sense notion of propositional theory of truth, right? The correctness theory of truth, correspondence theory of truth. And he's saying, but we've been talking about it as though the concept was really where the locus of truth is, not even in a proposition, but in the concept itself. So look what he says. But we have just remarked regarding this point that it is precisely in the concept of the manifold is sublated in as much as it pertains to intuition as opposed to the concept, and that through the concept the subject matter is reduced to its non-contingent essentiality. The latter does not enter into appearance, and this is why appearance is not something merely essential. Essences must appear, right? That line we saw from the so this is Hegel saying, but what we've been arguing is precisely that the concept matters most, not the things, the matters of intuition. There are no matters of intuition in the logic, right? There's no intuitive access to anything. But he says, merely essenceless, but is the manifestation of essence. When this manifestation of essence is set free, then we have the concept. So that's his shorthand for once this manifestation has been shown to be not a process of necessity, but necessity has been shown to itself be freedom. That's the end of actuality. Then only do we have the concept. So that's his shorthand for the arguments we made there about actuality, possibility, necessity, causality, reciprocity, all that stuff. These propositions that we are now recalling are not dogmatic assertions, for they are results that obtain, so all the claims he's just made, right? These aren't dogmatic assertions. Right? He's making them as dogmatic assertions, right? But they're not dogmatic assertions. Why not? Because he says, for they are results that obtain on their own out of the whole development of essence. I mean, we just went through the doctrine of essence to show these things, precisely what they have been justified by and substantiated by. The present position to which this development has led is that the form of the absolute, which is higher than being in essence, is the concept, right? The truth of being in essence is the concept. Viewed from this side, so from where we've argued to, right, we've imminently unfolded and shown. Viewed from this side, the concept has subjugated the spheres of being in essence to which, from the other starting point, feeling, intuition, representation, which appear to be its antecedent conditions, also belong. It has demonstrated itself to be, the concept of being, their unconditional foundation. But this is one side alone. There's a second side left to which the third book of the logic is devoted, namely the demonstration, literally the presentation, starstellum, the presentation, of how the concept forms within and from itself the reality that has vanished in it. All right, so there's a lot of stuff going on there, obviously. And this is Hegel speaking polemically, right? Not systematically. This is him saying, you can compare what I'm doing to the traditional notion as best represented by Kant. But what you get there is an account of this relationship between the concept and the thing. That is, the thing comes in through intuition, and we're trying to predicate things of it. This folder is black, and we get those correct or we don't, and that's where truth really lies, is in the relationship between the concept and the predication through a proposition made thereof about an object. But he says, we've argued the following, right? So he then does quick summation of being an essence, right? And says, what we've established in that unfolding is that the concept doesn't stand apart from being and have to be applied to it. It's what produces. So the question then becomes, well, how do you think truth then? Well, he loads in this other dimension where he says, yeah, but the process by which that being is generated is a free process. So here comes this weird formulation, right? You have to think truth together with freedom. They have to be thought together in some kind of way. And that means you have to think, broadly speaking, you have to think truth as a process, okay? And you have to think that process as self-causative and self-determining. What kind of notion of truth is that? I mean, that's not anywhere close to our standard conventional, Hegel's aware, that's what he's saying. It's not anywhere close to our standard conventional conceptions of truth. And yet, the doctrine of the concept is all about truth. Well, that comes to a head, that issue, that kind of problematic that's percolating underlying all these claims that are going on in subjectivity chapter, the objectivity chapter, come to a real head at the beginning of the idea chapter, right? Because there he's very clearly saying we have to think about truth now itself because the concept now has reached adequatio, it's reached adequation, right? It's reached an adequate account of itself. Well, it's an adequate concept now. It's not a formal concept like we had in subjectivity with all those wonderful logical forms. It's not a material concept, a real concept like we saw in objectivity. It's now an adequate concept. What does that mean? Well, as he tells us now, I'm going to throw you around a little bit, take a look on, this is already on 523. He says, right in the middle of 523, this is page 25 still in the German. About a quarter of the way down the page on 523, it's contrasted with them. So he's saying your standard conceptions of what the historical conception of truth is and of science is. It's contrasted with them. The logic is, of course, the formal science. Yet the science of the absolute form, which is implicit totality, and contains the pure idea of truth itself. Now notice that's already, again, disconcerting, right? Because form is not where truth is. Right? Truth is in the relationship between form content. That's our standard conventional notion. But he's saying, no, truth is right in the form itself. Why? Because the argument's been made that everything is the concept. So the concept is where truth is, not anything, not even a judgment about the concept, not even any claims about the concept and predicating it of something. The concept is truth itself. So he says, this absolute form has in it a content of reality of its own when it generates from itself. The concept, since it is not a trivial, empty identity, it's not our standard garden variety concept. It's not a class concept. It's not an inherent property concept. It's understanding the concept as generative of its own content. He says it's not a trivial, empty identity. It obtains its differentiated determinations. Here's its particularizations, right? In the moment of negativity or of absolute determining. It's self-causative, self-determining. And the content is only these determinations of the absolute form and nothing else. The content just is those things. So there's nothing left over. There's nothing, Kant would always have to say, well, we don't know what the manifold is going to show up and be. I mean, we know the conditions under a possibility that it can be. It has to meet those, right? But space-time, the categories, it has to meet those. But the particularities of it, we don't know that stuff, right? We don't have any way of grappling with that. But Hegel's saying, no, the nature of reality is already set in place by the concept itself. We don't have to wait for the manifold of intuition to show up and confirm or disconfirm that. So then he says, it is only these determinations of the absolute form and nothing else. A content posited by the form itself, and therefore adequate to it. There's that language already, the adequatio language. It's adequate to it. It's posited by it. It's produced by it. So of course it's adequate to it. It is it. Right? This form is for this reason of quite another nature than logical form is ordinarily taken to be. Yeah. Right? Logical form is ordinarily taken to be the abstract rules of thinking, and that alone. It's waiting on what it's to think about. This is a sense of logic. Speculative logic is a sense of logic that generates its own content out of its own form. So he says, it is truth already on its own account, because this content is adequate to its form, or this reality to its concept, and it is pure truth, because the determinations of the content do not yet have the form of an abstract otherness or an absolute immediacy. Right? The determinations of the content are not other. Right? They're not extrinsic to the concept. They're generated by the concept. So when Kant in the Critique of Pure Reason, in connection with logic, comes to discuss the old and famous question, what is truth? He starts by passing off as a triviality, the nominal definition that it is the agreement of cognition with its subject matter. So there's traditional correspondence, adequatio, Aquinas' theory of truth. A definition which is great, indeed, of supreme value. It's the one that Hegel's going to come back to, but he doesn't mean it in the same way, right? It's not the concept in agreement with subject matter. It's the concept is in agreement with itself. If we recall this definition together with the fundamental thesis of transcendental idealism, Kant, namely that rational cognition is incapable of comprehending things in themselves, Hegel constantly rails on this, right? He goes back to, we can't know the noumenal, right? We can't know the noumenal. We can't know that, we can think it, but we can't know the noumenal. That's the problem. He's trying to argue that we can actually know the noumenal. That's what the phenomenology argues. That reality lies absolutely outside the concept. It is then at once evident that such a reason, the Kantian conception of reason, which is the commonsensical conception, is incapable of comprehending things in themselves. The reality lies absolutely outside the concept. It is then at once evident that such a reason, one which is incapable of setting itself in agreement with its subject matter and the things in themselves, such as are not in agreement with the rational concept, a concept that does not agree with reality and a reality that does not agree with the concept, that these are untrue conceptions. So Kant poses the question, what is truth? But only to tell us we're constantly aspiring to it. We're constantly striving after it. But it's an asymptotic regulative ideal. We'll get towards it maybe, but we will never get it fully. Why? Because it's in the things in themselves, and we'll never know if our description about the book, the folder, that it's black, is really black because this is its appearance, not its noumenal status. If Kant had measured the idea of an intuitive understanding against that first definition of truth, so the intuitive understanding is God's being able to grasp things, and being able to grasp them generates them at the same time. If Kant had measured the idea of which is in the third critique, it's paragraph 79 or something. All the post-Kantians love that paragraph. If Kant had measured the idea of an intuitive understanding against that first definition of truth, against the adequatio definition, he would have treated that idea which expresses the required agreement not as a figment of thought, but rather as truth. It's a figment of thought because it's something you can think about. Kant's very clear about this. Well, arguably he's clear about this in the third critique, that the divine intellect, the intuitive understanding, posited in paragraph 79, is there for comparison only. We have a discursive understanding, right? That's Kant's point, is that we don't have an intuitive understanding. So we posit this idea of God, not because there is one, that's the figment of the imagination, the figment of thought we can have. But is Hegel's saying, but what he found there, that figment of thought, that's truth itself. That's what I've tried to show. He goes on with the polemic about Kant, but I just wanted to pull out that discussion of truth there because he returns to it in different fashion, well, in somewhat different fashion, at the beginning of the idea chapter. Take a look now with me at page 670. Yeah, 670. I always find this opening sentence in this chapter kind of astoundingly, brazenly amazing, because it's so unabashedly just declarative, right? And the closer you read it, the more it sort of is challenging about it. So this is page 670, 173 in the German. Hegel writes this at the beginning of section 3 of the idea. The idea is the adequate concept. So there's that language again, right? It's the adequate concept. It's not the formal concept, this is the distinction, right, of subjectivity. It's not the real concept of objectivity. It's now the adequate concept. So that's literally the fundamental defining definition of, or defining a formulation for the idea. What is the idea? It's the adequate concept, right? None of the other concepts. He calls it the objectively true, or the true as such. Okay. So now we're not aspiring to truth, we got truth. He then says, and this is one that always stuns me. If anything has truth, what does that even mean? If anything has truth, already we're talking in a kind of different way about truth, right, than the commonsensical notion of truth, because the commonsensical notion is something that you ascribe. It's about propositions, right? So it's not about things. It's not about objects. It's not about any of that kind of stuff. That's not what truth is. Truth's about the relationship between propositions, right, and the state of affairs that it's making propositions about which it's speaking. That's the commonsensical notion. But already he's saying that's not enough. Right? That's not as far as we've gotten it. We have the truth as such. If anything has truth, it has truth, by virtue of its idea. Well, if you stop there, we're not going to stop there, but if you stop there, right, you as a Platonist could say, right. I mean, I can make some sense out of that as a Platonist, right? Plato could look at that and go, yeah, this folder has truth because it's the instantiation of the idea of folder as such. And so now we can talk about this folder is black and whatnot because it participates in, or it's instantiation of, all crude ways of thinking about the charismos, the separation, as Aristotle famously called it, between the world of becoming and the world of being in Plato. And so the forms, the ideas, things participate in them, they're instantiated in the world. And so if anything has any truth means it really participates in the form itself. So you could stop there, you could go, it has it by virtue of its idea. Well, okay, by virtue of being an instantiation or participation in the form of whatever it is as such. The folder, that idea folder as such. But then look at what he says. Or something has truth only insofar as it is idea, not has idea. He's very aware of what he's saying, right? I'm not saying that this is a relational concept. That's precisely why that is. It's an identity claim. It's not a relational claim. It participates in the idea. It is related to it in some way. And so you can get that right or get that wrong through your ascriptions about it, through your utterances about it, through your statements made about it, your propositions made about it. The folder is black. Well, have I properly lined up the concept of fold and the concept of black with both of those ideas, and have I joined them appropriately in the world in which they're adhering in one thing? That's my judgment I'm making. There's where the truth lies, is in my agreement between my statement and the state of affairs about which the statement is asserting, claim about. He's saying those things are true to the extent that they are the idea. Now, he's already folded in the idea earlier, and he's about to come back to it because he's about to tell you the passages that we quoted last week, that to think about the idea in this way means to think about it not as a dead repose, right, a dead rest, but to think about it precisely as a process. So as he says, take a look at take a look at the bottom of page 671. This is 174 in the German. The paragraph there at the bottom begins, but since the result now is that the idea is the unity of the concept and objectivity. So here's Hegel saying, okay, what the hell do I mean by truth? Right? What is this claim about that we start off with, that something has truth only so far as it is idea? Not has idea, but is literally idea. Not predicated of it, but literally is the idea. What does that even mean? So here's where he starts to unpack that, I think. He says, but since the result now is that the idea, so where we've got to, is the unity of the concept and objectivity, So you can hear that as the formal concept, subjectivity, right? Ultimately expressed in the disjunctive syllogism. And objectivity, ultimately expressed in extrinsic teleology. We must not regard it as just a goal which is to be approximated. There's that Kantian sense, right? It's not something we're striving after because it always lies beyond us asymptotically we approach it. But itself remains always a kind of beyond. We must rather regard, so that's the, it's not a jenseits. It's not something that's beyond us, right? That we're constantly seeking after. It's not a regulative idea, to use the Kantian formulation. He says, we must rather regard everything as being actual. It's a pretty significant claim. It's a reformulation of the claim he started off the chapter with, but it's pretty amazing again. We must rather regard everything as being actual only to the extent, so everything is actual now. Everything is, not has truth, but is at all. So already you can tell where this is headed. We're moving from a correspondence theory of truth, a propositional theory of truth, to a material ontological theory. So he says, we must rather regard everything as being actual only to the extent that it has the idea in it and expresses it. It is not just that the subject matter, the objective and the subjective world, ought to be in principle congruent with the idea. They ought to match up with one another. That's not the claim he thinks he's made. The two are themselves rather the congruence, right? The accord of concept and reality. A reality that does not correspond to the concept a reality that does not correspond to the concept is mere appearance. Something subjective, accidental, arbitrary, something which is not the truth. So notice the measure now is not, did I get my judgment right? Did I get my proposition right? Does it correspond with the state of affairs that I'm predicating it on? But does being actually match up to the concept? When it is said that there is no subject matter to be found in experience which is perfectly congruent with the idea, it's the commonsensical notion. Nothing measures up to the forms, the ideas of things. The latter is opposed to the actual as a subjective standard. There's the subjective standard, right? We're always trying to get there. But there is no saying what anything actual might possibly be in truth. There's that formulation. It's a weird formulation, right? What does it mean to say something in truth? If its concept is not in it and its objectivity does not measure up to this concept, it would then be a nothing. Not a mistake, right? Not a failure, not a falsehood that you've uttered, but it actually wouldn't be. So truth here is not a matter of correspondence between proposition and state of affairs. It's something about the way in which the concept itself operates, in which the concept is. He then says, if its concept is not in it and its objectivity does not measure up to the concept, it would then be a nothing. Indeed, the mechanical and the chemical object, like a subject devoid of spirit and a spirit conscious only of finitude and not of its essence, do not, according to their various natures, have their concept concretely existing in them in its own free form. We've seen him argue that it exists in them, but not as free. It's submerged in them, sunk in them. But they can be something at all true only insofar as they are the union of their concept and reality, of their soul and their body. So now Hegel is saying, right, the chemical dimension and the mechanical dimension of reality is what it is only insofar as it expresses the concept. That's really insofar as they are at all. So it's an ontological status, that truth. That's the notion of truth that we're talking about. Then you get, strangely in Hegel, this kind of amazing moment where he says, let me give you some examples. We're 670 pages in, right? Here's one of the first times we get an actual example of Hegel of anything. So look at what he says. Wholes like the state, so totalities, wholes, like the state and the church, cease to exist in concreto when the unity of their concept and their reality is dissolved. So there's a concept of state, there's a concept of church, whatever those things are, and it's when they fail to be those things, when they fail to measure up, when they fail to be adequate to that concept, that they dissolve. Not that we make false claims about them. They actually are no longer existing. They're no longer, in Hegel's terms, actual. They're mere appearance. They cease to exist in concreto when the unity of their concept and their reality is dissolved. The human being, the living thing, is dead when soul and body are parted in it. Dead nature, the mechanical and the chemical world, that is when the dead is taken to mean the inorganic world, for the expression would otherwise have no positive meaning at all. This dead nature, then, if it is separated into its concept and its reality, is nothing but the subjective abstraction of a thought form and a formless matter. So that's what happens when you separate them. He's just arguing that you can't. Spirit that were not idea, not the unity of the concept with the self, not the concept that has the concept itself as its reality, would be dead spirit. Spiritless spirit, a mere material object in that way. Since the idea is the unity of the concept and reality, being has attained this significance, I think you can also hear it in there, the status of truth. It now is, notice that's the way to think about truth, as something that is, therefore only what the idea is. Now, he comes back to this notion of the state again. This is never, Hegel gives you examples, but they're not great examples and you'll want more from them, right? Because he doesn't really play them out in the way as you might think. He doesn't elaborate them far enough. But look at what he does say at the bottom of 672, just to follow through the example. He says, this is the last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I'm sorry, 1, 2. Yeah, 6 lines up from the bottom. But if a subject matter, say the state, see where I'm at? But if a subject matter, say the state, did not at all conform to its idea, that is to say, if it were not rather the idea of the state. So that's what he means to say when something has, it is its idea. So if the state doesn't measure up to this, if it doesn't embody that, if it doesn't, use another term for it, actualize that, it did not correspond at all to the concept, its soul and body would have come apart. The soul would have taken refuge in the secluded regions of thought. The body had been dispersed into singular individualities. But because so that's the dissolution of the state, literally, right? The state idea is either embodied or it's not. That's the way to think about it. So notice, truth is a matter not of propositions, but of concepts. Right? It's a feature that is more bound up with concepts than it is with things and the relationship between things and certainly the relationship between propositions. He then says, top of 673, 175 in the German. But because the concept of the state is essential to the nature of these individualities, so they split up, they're all just these individuals. It is present in them as so mighty an impulse. Here comes this language of Trieb again. Impulse. They are driven to the state, that they are driven to translate it, the concept of the state, the idea of the state, into reality, be it only in the form of external proposiveness, only in the form of something that's expedient, something we have to make use of. So even the barest state is an expedient state, right? It's a state that serves human purposes, right? That are, in that sense, imposed upon them from without. It's an instrument of that realization of those subjective purposes. In the very, as he says here, be it only in the form of external propositions, or to put up with it as it is, right? So we're going to make use of it for what we can, even though it's not the full expression of it. It's not the state in its truth. It can be a state in its appearance, and because the state is nonetheless there, that idea is there to be had, we can still find it there, we can still express it in this way. Or to put up with it as it is, or else that must needs perish. That's a tantalizing line. What does it mean to say that we ought to, must needs perish? Does that mean it must fall apart and we allow it to dissolve? It's inadequate? Or does that mean we need to do something about that? So reform, revolution are options there. He then says, to put up with it as is, or else that must needs perish. The worst state, the worst state, it's still a state, right? The worst state, one whose reality least corresponds to the concept. That begins to give you some sense of what it means to be a true state. It means to be in accordance with the concept, not the concept in accordance with it. The worst state, one whose reality least corresponds to the concept, insofar as it still has concrete existence, as far as it is at all, is yet idea. It's not the fullness of the idea, right? It's not the completeness of the idea. It doesn't fully accord with the idea, fully accord with the concept, so therefore it's not an adequate state. But it's a state. It is. then individuals still obey the power of concept. Well, in those few lines is packed a whole political philosophy, frankly, right? So we're not about to sit here and go, by the way, Hegel's political philosophy 1816 is this, right? But I do think a lot of what he does think about, thinking about concepts as being the truth bearers, right? Is embedded in, is exemplified in that kind of example that he's talking about. All right. Now, he then goes on to introduce this notion of, in the next paragraph down, that the idea we need to think of as the unity of subject to concept and objectivity. That's what we've been doing. But that means we have to think of it, he says in the next paragraph, the next page, this is where we were talking about, as not as a dead repose, but as a process. So I just wanted to track that line of thinking through there, because there's this problematic of truth that Hegel's been grappling with for quite some time in the doctrine of the concept. We haven't been tracking it and honing in on it every time, but that's the thread that's running through this. And he's coming back to it here at the beginning of this. And the thing he's linking together is a couple of ideas. One is that to think of truth at the level in which we're trying to grapple with it, is to think about it as, to use the Heideggerian distinction between propositional truth. Obviously, that's what he's rejecting. That's not the model to think of. Doesn't mean you can't do propositional truth for Hegel, right? Just means that's not what's at stake here. We're talking about what Heidegger would famously call material truth. Material truth. That is the accord of something with its concept, or better said, not with just its concept, but the concept. The concept. And then, okay, fine, that's one thing to say. And Heidegger's example of this is to say that it's the accord of the thing with the intellect. Right? This is on the question of truth essay from Heidegger, on the essence of truth, where he says, the concept that this is the thing in accordance with the intellect, and that's the divine intellect, right? As Heidegger says it. So it means that the thing must accord with the divine intellect. Well, Hegel is already saying this is not a divine intellectual thing, right? This is the concept itself that the thing must accord with. And then, having given you that, you could just say, okay, well, either it measures up to the concept or it doesn't. And then, next paragraph down is where he unloads on you and says, yeah, but the concept, you can't think of it as a dead repose. In other words, you can't think of it as an empty, whole, vacuous, stable thing to which things are supposed to be brought into accordance with. No, it's a process itself. So, this is where he famously makes this claim. He says, this is on 674, it's 177 in the German. He says, all this yields the following closer determinations of the idea. So I always love this passage because this is Hegel sort of summing up, okay, we've had all these sort of discussions about what the idea is. It's the adequate concept. That pushed us into this discussion of truth. What do we take out of there to mean what the idea really means? What does it really mean to talk about the idea? He says, first, the idea is the simple truth, the identity of concept and objectivity as a universal. So there's the first determination, right? Closer determination. As a universal, what kind of universal? In which the opposition, the presence of the particular, is dissolved in its self-identical negativity and is equality or equal with itself. Well, again, that's the shorthand for what we saw in the first chapter of subjectivity. Universality particularizes itself into singularity. That's the way of thinking about that. So this is a concrete universal, which is always what it is in its particularization, nothing unto itself. He then says, second is the connection, for Helmholtz, the relation of the subjectivity of the simple concept existing for itself and of the concept's objectivity, which is distinguished from it. So there's the formal concept and the real concept, subjectivity chapter and the objectivity chapter. The former, subjectivity, is essentially the impulse to sublate, take up, cancel, and preserve, this separation, which is what we've seen as we've worked through this. And the latter, objectivity, is indifferent positiveness, subsistence which is in and for itself is null. So that's where you start off with, just being in and for itself. But we realize, oh, wait a minute, it's not being in and for itself. That's not what objectivity is. It is immediate existence for the sake of, that's what it turns out to be, right? An external purposiveness in teleology, for the sake of the concept. So he says, as this connection, this relation, the idea is the process. So universality, relation, process, these are all the closer determinations of what we mean by the idea. It is the process of disrupting itself, literally differentiating itself into individuality and into the latter's inorganic nature, and of then bringing this inorganic nature again under the controlling power of the subject and back to the first simple universality. That's his shorthand for subjectivity into objectivity and objectivity into external teleology, come back to itself now in life. The identity of the idea with itself is one with the process, the thought that liberates actuality from the seeming, right? The shine, the seeming appearance of purposeless mutability and transfigures it into idea. It's not just alteration after alteration, alternation, I should say, after alteration, like we saw in the logic of being. It's now transfigures it into idea, must not represent the truth of actuality as dead repose, as a mere picture, numb, without impulse and movement, as a genius or number, as an abstract thought. The idea, because of the freedom which the concept has attained in it, also has the most stubborn opposition within it. Its repose consists in the assurance and certainty. So if you're going to use the language of rest, repose, harmony, and peace, its repose, its harmony, its peace consists in the assurance and the certainty with which it eternally generates that opposition. There's its peace, its harmony, that it constantly others itself, negates itself, and eternally overcomes it, relates to itself in and through that opposition, and in it rejoins itself. Now, at that point, you want to back up and say, I think he just said something like the following two claims over this introductory material. I think he just made two claims, which he did. One is that to think truth is to think truth ontologically and materially. That's the nature of truth in the logic. Logic is an ontological matter whose truth bearer is not propositions. So it's not a matter of correspondence in the sense in which we normally think of adequatio as the adequatio of the intellect to the thing, right? The correspondence of the thing, of the intellect to the thing. We make a proposition, we say, this is black, we either get that right or wrong. It's not that. It's not that that's wrong, it's just that that's a representational account of truth. So it's not the speculative understanding of truth. What's the speculative understanding of truth? Truth is ontological and material. It's when things accord with the concept itself. So when he says that the idea is the concept that's adequate, the adequate concept, that's all folded into that. To say that what we've now shown is that the concept is not just a set of universality, particularity, singularity, so conceptual determinations. It's not just judgment forms, it's not just syllogistic forms. Wonderful as all those things are, we've shown that those things actually generate reality, objectivity from themselves. So that's in accord with the concept. Not the concept's in accord with them, they're in accord with the concept. That's why objectivity ends, frankly, with extrinsic purposiveness, extrinsic teleology. The objectivity exists for the sake of the concept. Now that produces all sorts of issues we've talked about, but it ultimately leads to the notion of intrinsic purposiveness, which is what we're about to treat with life itself. So that's the first claim, right? That if we're going to think about truth, we've got to think about truth as ontological and material, and that means the thing in accordance with the concept. So far, so good. A lot to dig out there, a lot to work with, but that's the first is truth. The first claim about truth. And then the second one, I always think that first claim is, well, that's, important and interesting, and it is, but it's not uniquely Hegel. Right? Others could have made that same claim. Right? To be is to be an expression of the idea. That's an ontological theory of truth. Right? To be in its truth is for something to be an expression of. Something is true to the extent that it expresses its concept, expresses its form, expresses its idea. That's Plato, that's Aristotle, that's a bunch of people. You could have them all flow out of that. The fact that the propositional theory of truth is the one that we've clung on to as the primary theory of truth, the predominant and dominating theory of truth, hasn't precluded people, right, figures in the history of philosophy, from thinking that other way about truth. It's an ontological material matter. So, Hegel's emphasizing that he's reached that position. And he means by it something similar but not the same as the ways in which other people have meant it, because there's not a participatory relationship, there's not an instantiation relationship, there's no efficient material, final causality relationship, as we see in Aristotle. So there's not all that, those various apparatuses for thinking through that, but it is an ontological material conception of truth. The second claim is the one that really makes truth, Hegel's conception of truth makes it uniquely Hegelian. And it's that the concept is a process. So, because that's what it means to think truth as freedom, right? Just go back to my question again. Because thinking about truth materially and ontologically is one, that gets you so far, right? And you can clearly distinguish it, as he's doing, right, from the classical conventional theories of truth, which, are best expressed by Kant, which ultimately mean that truth is always a beyond that you're aspiring towards, right? I'm trying to get the correctness of my judgments to match up to the state of affairs about which I'm predicating. And that's an endless affair, right, that I'm going to take on for the rest of my being, and so will everyone else. But Hegel's saying, well, yeah, that's fine, you can talk about it that way, but truth ultimately is really material, ontological. And it's the thing in accordance with the concept. Like the state is in accord with the concept, or it's not in accord with the concept. But then you have to say, okay, that's fine, but what does it mean to say that it's in accord with the concept when the concept is a process? And that's where things get tricky. If the concept were something unto itself, stable, rigid, fixed, like arguably the form of something is in Plato, then you could say it matches or it doesn't match it, right? Because it either bears out those features or it doesn't bear out those features, right? If the form of chair is something to be sat upon, if it can't be sat upon, it's not a chair, right? It doesn't bear it out. So you can, but that's because the form, chairness, retains its fixity. And you just figure out whether things in the world match up to that fixity or not. But Hegel's denying you that, right? Because he's argued that the concept is not fixed. It's this process that produces its otherness, and in producing its otherness, comes to be itself, comes into itself, rejoins itself, relates to itself. That's, to me, what makes it so difficult to think the Hegelian, whatever it is, theory of truth, conception or account of truth, because not only is it an ontological conception of truth, the material theory of truth, it's absolutely that. It's a material theory of truth that is always in process, where that process is one of determinate negation. So then you have to ask yourself, what would it mean for something to be in accord with that process? I mean, that's the question, right? What would it mean for something to, because that's when it's in its truth. Something's in its truth just insofar as he said, it is idea, right? Not it has idea, it bears some idea, it relates to it, none of that. It is idea. Well, that means that it is in accord with that process itself as a process. So that means in some sense, something is true only to the extent that it's processional. Yes. Something is true to the extent that it's only is itself only so far as it's becoming other than itself. Yes. So something's not true because it's fixed. Something's true because it's unstable. It disrupts. It's disruptive of itself. It others itself and comes to be itself continually in and through that becoming continually other than. All right. So I don't know where all that goes, right? Let's be very, very clear, right? But those are the outlines, as far as I can tell, of Hegel's account of truth. He's going to come back to it again in the method chapter. So, but you won't read that and go, oh, that solves everything, right? You'll go back to that and say, oh my God, it is everything. Because that's what he's going to claim, right? He's going to claim that what the book has shown is that the concept is everything. There is nothing outside the concept. So the concept literally is everything, and everything is in its truth, insofar as it is the concept it measures up to, is adequate to the concept. But of course, the concept is a process of generating. So this is what we're going to come continually back to. And that's why I think Hegel's conception of truth is that something is in its truth when it negates itself and is itself in and through its own negation. When it bears out negativity itself, when it just is that negative operation of determined negativity and comes to be itself in and through that determined negation. Let me major with that.
So there's the idea of the fixation and the process and the freedom and the truth. Okay, I get that there's a dissolution of the dichotomies, and he has explained that ontologically, logically. Okay, I have two questions.
Sure.
Still, I don't get, especially in this part of on freedom. If freedom is both a contingency, because it has to be, and a necessity, absolute necessity, but it has to be in the process philosophy because it gives everyone the free will of their particularity, but it is universal at the same time.
Yep.
So, because we need to ground the possibility of freedom.
Yeah.
But I don't get. I have a difficulty on understanding Hegel's perspective as a God's eye perspective. Hegel, as a concrete universality himself, writing this book, where does he get this distance position that allows him to write everything like this?
Yeah.
And doesn't his particularity create a problem? Because this is only him.
Yeah.
The contingency of his views.
Right. So let me reframe your question just slightly and see if it's okay with you. I don't want to lose what you're saying by this reframing. That's not what I want to do. I want to just be a little closer to what I think how Hegel poses this question, or how this question is appropriately posed in Hegel, which I think is really an important question. And the broad framework of something like, what's the stance from which the logic can be written? This is one of the versions I was talking with other people earlier today about the Schellingian panlogistic critique of Hegel. And one of Schelling's kind of, this is not the core of his critique of Hegel, but one of his asides pretty continually in the 1841 lectures in Berlin about Hegel is that, I'm paraphrasing massively, so please don't go look in the lecture course and find out, try to find where this particular quote is. I'm not quoting, I'm paraphrasing. Where does he get off? Who does he think he is? Right? By what right? I mean, these are all ways of asking the same question. Where do you stand vis-a-vis the absolute to be able to say these things about, who do you think you are? And Hegel, that was 1841, so this is after Hegel's death, right? But Hegel's already formulated that question, not that question, because he doesn't say, who do I think I am? He formulates it this way, what's the position from which you can make these kinds of claims? And the position that you can make these kind of claims from is quite clearly the position of absolute knowing, which is a position that you would ask the question, well, if that's what entitles you to be able to make these kinds of claims, right? If that's the epistemic status you must have in order to be able to make claims like we're making, then how do you know you've gotten there? Well, as he says to us, the phenomenology demonstrates that we're to that point. And he thinks that is, those of you who read the phenomenology will know this, he thinks that's not just a formal claim, but that's also a historical claim. Now, this is always tricky business in Hegel. I admit this right from the outset. And I think Hegel thinks this is problematic ground as well. So I don't think I'm speaking out of school for Hegel here. He's saying the we, so it's not a Hegel problem, right? It's not who does he think he is. It's who do we think we are. That's the way he would formulate the question. And he would say, we are the inheritors of a certain position within history that affords us this opportunity that has not been afforded to prior generations. We live we live in the affordances, the abilities that modernity has bequeathed to us. And this is why all this language at the beginning of the phenomenology, in the preface of the phenomenology. It's also a bit in the introduction, where he's saying, we live at the ripe time, the ripe age. And you see a bit of it. I tried to point it out in the introduction to the Science of Logic. I know it's long ago now, but it's back in the introduction to the Doctrine of Being, where he's talking about, we live in an age in which we live as post-Kantians, right? And we live as post-Kantians in the theoretical domain. In the practical domain, we live as post-French revolutionaries. We live in the behest, or the bequest, better said, of which those historical events allow us to live. And so there is a historical, this is why things get tricky, a historical condition to our epistemic stance, but not a historical presupposition. This is the trick, right? And I mean that to say, not here's the ruse that he's putting over on us, not trick in that sense, but here's the real conundrum that you've got to try to make sense of. How can we be in this position? We're in this position because of the historical moment that's afforded us to be in this position. Now, that's the phenomenological realm, right? That's what he says. I'm massively reducing the phenomenology and all of its wonder of 400 pages down to those trivial little claims, but that is what the phenomenology argues. But as you well know at this point, he says, or you could just, engage in abstract thinking, and you're there. Set aside all presuppositions, and you're there. We can do that. We have that resolve that we can make to just set aside, not to reject them all, right? Again, it's not a rejection. It's more like the Husserlian epoche. It's more like putting these in abeyance, more like setting these aside. Let's set all these commitments and presuppositions that we have, which, of course, if you're Gadamer or someone, Herod or you're Dilthey, you think, we can't do that. Those things define us. Right? They make us who and what we are. Those presuppositions, those, as Gadamer famously says in Truth and Method, those prejudices, prejudgments, are part of what makes us who and what we are. We shouldn't reject them all. Right? That's the mistake of the Enlightenment system. Reject them all. We should embrace them as being informative of who and what we are. It's our traditionality. Right? Well, Hegel's saying, well, our traditionality can afford us a certain position that allows us to, let me use a problematic term here, but I think it gets at it, transcend that traditionality. That's the way I read absolute knowing vis-a-vis the relationship to history. Right? Absolute knowing as a historically constituted position from which you can speak non-historically. Absolute knowing knows the truth in its absoluteness, not in its historical conditionality. So it's speaking without the constraint of history. Or you can set aside all those things and you would be in the same position. You'd be able to think absolutely. And that's how you've got. So that's roughly how we enjoy this position of being able to make these claims. I think I missed some of what your comment though was about, saying that. Went down that pathway rather than another. Do you want to come back to some other element of it?
I don't remember it,
Yeah.
but so is it the historical transcendentality allows us this privileged position, or historical transcendence, which might, whatever it might be?
Yeah. So I appreciate that. So of course, Hegel would never say the historical transcendentality, right? Because he doesn't traffic in that verbiage, and doesn't think about it that way. That's not his formulations for how he thinks about absolute knowing. He does think about it as absolute knowing knows the absolute in its truth. And that means it must not be reducible to, it must therefore, in a certain sense, transcend, but not separate itself from. But it must rise above its indebtedness or its confinement within its historical manifestation. That's what he means by it. So you could say it's a historically one transcendence. Historically one transcendence, right? That Hegel says, it's not just me over here in Jena, Heidelberg and Berlin. It's not that. It's not about, strangely enough, it's really not about me. That's the caricature critique that we get out of Schelling and those afterwards. This is all about how the individual Hegel think these things. And so there's the real problem of individuality in Hegel, right? How does this individual, namely Hegel, think these things? That's cheap version of Kierkegaard, right? So, and Sartre does the same version. It's a lot of people. But for him, it's a matter of how do we, this is the phenomenological we in the phenomenology, right? How do we have this ability to have this insight. It's because we've won it historically. And it's available to us, and it was not available earlier. Those of Thomas Aquinas' generation, of Thomas's generation, could not have done this. It was not there for them to do. Was it there? Was the truth there? Yeah, the truth was there. But they didn't have access. We have access.
So is it a history of being?
Sorry?
Is it a history of being?
No, because being itself is not historical. It's a history of the access to being. That I'll go for. Because it's a form of, it's the shape of a world, as he puts it in the phenomenology, that affords us the insight into how the absolute is for itself. That's the shape of the world, the modern world in which we live, that affords us that insight that the classical world did not afford us. Is that
Yes,
helpful with that?
thank you so much.
You know,
How does just the other route into the logic work in terms of what you just said? Does it contradict what you just said, or it, in the sense of like, does people at the time of Thompson class, could they just will to think abstractly?
So let me give you two answers to that question. Because I honestly think there are two answers to that question. Because Hegel presents them as in two different ways. And I don't know how to reconcile. So let me acknowledge that from the outset. So when you come back to me and say, but I don't think those, I'm going to say, right, I don't know as they do. The first portrayal of them, we've looked at it here in the Science of Logic beginning, where he says, look, you can go down one pathway. It's the mediated pathway through the phenomenology, or you can go down the immediate pathway, which is just to set aside all these prejudgments, presuppositions, and you'll be at absolute thinking itself. It's as though you could go one way or the other. And the choice to do one way or the other looks available, here's where you're going, or here's what you're asking about, at all times to all people. Right? Now, the phenomenology is not available to everyone at all times, but the other one seems to be, at least theoretically, right, available there, because it doesn't have any historical conditionality to it. That's how I read him in 1812 when he wrote that. That's what I read him saying. I think by 1830, he's reconsidered that matter fairly robustly. And there's already the inklings of this in the material that we looked at, but let me not make the case from there. The later material, so the 1830 edition of the Encyclopedia, the introduction to that text is where he's, I think, rethought this matter and come to the conviction that, well, you can't just think abstractly, to will to think abstractly. You've got to work through the presupposition. Now, do you have to go through the whole phenomenological route? You have to redo the phenomenology? He's convinced that that's not the case. But you do have to go through what he calls, in that text, the positions of thought with respect to objectivity. You have to look at the positionality of thought with respect to objectivity and the various possibilities for that positionality, which is what he lays out in that text. It's already there in 1817, an undeveloped version of it. But clearly by 1827, 2030, he's got a full-fledged version of that. And at that point, it seems like the two are mutually reinforcing. Better said, that the what had been called the phenomenological route, which is a revised phenomenological route by 1830, is the predecessor to then being able to take the step of thinking, resolutely thinking freely and abstractly, without presupposition. So it looks like they're mutually conditioning. I think I can make the argument that that's right, but the way he literally presents it in 1830 is they're sequential. You need to have the positionality of thought that sets up the possibility then of setting aside all those commitments and thinking abstractly directly. So there he's articulating not just two routes you can take, pick your route, which is closer to what you get here strictly. You get there, no, one is actually the prerequisite for the other. The phenomenological is prerequisite for the thinking abstractly. Is that?
Yeah, thank you.
But and I've mentioned this before, and I think we've talked about this as well. But this is what's rich about this. It's because he's, in my view, one of the reasons for that rethinking is he's rethought what he means by erfahrung, what he means by experience. It meant something in the phenomenology in a very, he defines it there in the introduction in a very specific way. And he's rethought that, and frankly, he would not want to say this. So let's be clear. But I think this, where else is this coming from? In a kind of, dialogue is not the right term. As a response to Schleiermacher, his archenemy and nemesis in Berlin, right? And never shall I be in that school. That's a historical school. I don't want to be over there. They're all nuts. We're the philosophical school. That was the divide, right? And at the University of Berlin, you were either for Schleiermacher in that school or you were for Hegel in the philosophical school, and never the twain shall meet. But I do think that, so I acknowledge that, but I do think that Hegel was compelled to rethink what he meant by experience by what the Schleiermachians historical school was saying. That's probably more than you wanted. Sorry.
Okay, but one last thing maybe. So where do we get the articulation of that latter?
It's in the introduction to 1830. It's there where he's talking about, I mean, he only does it really in 2 or 3 paragraphs, where he's talking about Erfahrung there, and rather than meaning this kind of dialectical relationship between consciousness and objectivity as it shows up, which is the way he defines it in the introduction to the phenomenology. There it really means all these presuppositions, all this, it's a thicker conception of experience, where it means, really it's another term for traditionality, right? That's really what it means. Right? It doesn't just mean this interaction, it really means the repository, I'm being reductive here, but the repository of what we inherit from the tradition itself. All that comes with it, all the baggage that comes with it. And we don't simply have a relationship to it, we're formed by it. So it's much closer to, a hermeneutical position, which is what Schleiermacher is articulating, than the earlier view, which is more strictly phenomenological in the Hegelian sense, not like circles. Does that make some sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, Kathleen.
So this is a question about the
I
relationship.
think I saw you. I'm coming to you. Yeah, I just didn't want you to think of. Yep, sorry.
This is a question about the relationship between truth and freedom. Now that we're kind of thinking them together.
Yeah.
So we've heard that freedom, in this sense, often means being like self-determining or self-causing.
Yeah.
And then truth, we've seen earlier this language of the truth of as being associated with retrogressive grounding, and that's kind of how the logic works. So can we associate then retrogressive grounding and like being self-causing or self-determining? Is there some connection between like the freedom and truth of the concept and this method of retrogressive grounding? Like, or can we associate retrogressive grounding with being self-causing? Because I'm trying to think how those could come together.
So let me try to work at it this way. I think there's 2 locutions or formulae that Hegel falls back on repeatedly to talk about this issue that you're talking about. One of them is X is the truth of Y. Right? We hear him say that all the time. Essence is the truth of being. The concept is the truth of being in essence. He uses that locution all the time. This is that, and what he means by that is this is the retrogressive ground of what preceded it. Right? So the truth of language means it's not just it's got the right view of the matter, right? It's not the corrected view of what we were. This is not. Oh, now we finally did essence right. That's not what the truth of essence. It's not what to say essence is the truth of being. Doesn't mean we finally got being right. And essence doesn't mean that when we say that the concept is the truth of essence, we don't mean we finally got essence right. What it means is no, it's the ground of that which preceded it. It follows from it, but it's the retrogressive ground of it. Now, the other term he uses, the other location he uses less frequently, but it's there, is this is something in its truth. In its truth. And that's what I've been basically elaborating with this notion of ontological or material truth, right? Trying to parse that out a bit. So what is it to say that something is in its truth? Because you could also say, you could formulate the totality of the science of logic by saying, look, what you have in the concept is you have being and essence in their truth. Right? This is in their truth. But here, come back to your question now about freedom. Because I think this is really the key moment, right? As I was just saying, what makes Hegel's theory of truth, is the process moment. And that's the self-causative, self-generative, self-determining, as you were saying, freedom, the way he thinks about freedom there. And so I think the answer to that is yes, because what he's saying to your question is yes. Because what he's saying there, as I'm reading, is that when he says that essence is the truth of being, is he's saying essence generates being. It causes being to be. But what generates essence, what causes essence to be, is the concept. Because it's freedom itself. And so the retrogressive ground always turns out to be that not only by which the the prior thing is what it is, but also is what generates it itself. So think about this moment where he says in the logic of essence, he says, we said initially that being others itself into essence. It necessarily sublates itself and becomes essence. And then we go off and discuss essence on its own terms for quite a while, right? We talk about this is where we get identity, difference, all that kind of wonderful stuff, the essentialities of reflection. And then there's that moment where he says, but essence is inherently contradictory. And because it's contradictory, it has to other itself. Essence has to other itself. And at that moment, it others itself. It has, what does it have? It has existence. What's that? That's grounded being. It's literally how he defines it. It's grounded being. Well, that means that it's now what generates being. Right? Essence is what generates being. That process generates being. Well, we don't know what that process name is yet. It's reflection at that point, right? It reflects out of itself. Essence is reflect out of itself and posit existence, which is grounded being. So now we have the generation of being itself. But what we ultimately find out is that the essence is itself produced by what? The concept. What is the concept? The process of self-generation. It is freedom, to use the other term for that.
So could we say that in the sense of truth of retrogressive grounding, that's a maybe good way to think of like the different moments of the process, but then this self-generating aspect of truth and freedom is more to capture the process itself, not just the relation between the moments that it generates.
I think that's exactly right. I think that, when you say, as we rightly do, when you say now that we've almost reached the end of the science of logic, you want to say, well, look, what's the simplest, way of stating its main thesis? Well, the truth of being is essence, and the truth of essence is the concept. That's the argument, right? And of course, tons of stuff have to be worked out for all that to make sense, but that's what it is. But you're quite right that what that's saying at one level is just it's marking out the moments, right? What is because it is what it is, being is essence. And essence is what it is because of the movement of the concept. It is because it is freedom. That's how it is. That's what it is. So that's all generated out of the concept itself. And so that's marking the moments, but that's also getting back to the process that produced, engendered, caused all those moments to be in the first place. So it gives them that kind of regressive, retrogressive backing into the ground from which they all are caused. By what? By this movement of freedom, which is self-generative. And that means that there's nothing more fundamental than it because it generates itself, right? It self-causes sui. So there's nothing prior to it, nothing antecedent to it that brings it about. We haven't asserted that, Aristotle that's a bit much, regularly argued, and Aquinas always argues that we can't tolerate an infinite regress, and that's why we have to posit something at the start of all things. That's why you have a mover, that's why you have a uncaused cause, all that kind of wonderful stuff. Hegel's argued back that there is nothing before this, not because we human beings, it's not our problem, it's not a reason problem, which is what it is in Aquinas. Or in even those moments in Aristotle, this is the nature of reality itself, entails that it be self-generative of itself. Not because we couldn't tolerate an infinite regress. That's the problem. It's the nature of reality itself that it's this way. So I just wanted to add that onto that. Is that useful?
Yeah,
helpful at all?
Trying to kind of bring together some of the method stuff with this kind of later on point, and I feel like it's helpful to think of maybe the doctrine of the first the objective logic as more being about the moments, and then the subjective logic about the process itself. And so there's kind of a different shift in where the focus is or something like that.
I absolutely agree with that. I mean, one of the ways I've tried to characterize that in the class is to say, look, the objective logic is a relational ontology that's beholden to a generative process that it doesn't articulate, but always gestures towards. Gestures is not quite specific and rigorous enough term for this because it's always implying it, right? That's what reflection is, right? Reflection is a first moment, arguably one becoming is one, literally the first moment. But it's always, implying this. But so it's relational ontology, objective logic, that ultimately goes back to a process ontology, process account in the in the subjective logic. I think that's exactly right. And the only thing I want to sort of push it, and I think you did a nice job of suggesting this, is that it's not just as though you got this relational ontology that implies a process ontology. And now we finally got the process ontology. I think the additional, so that's all true, but the additional moment is, and that process is what generated, produced, caused those relations and the relata that are born out of them. That's what I take this language of, we've now reached the adequacy of objectivity to subjectivity, of objectivity to the concept. Right? That's what the adequate concept, that's what the idea is. That's when we can say that, because only then have we actually shown, through the objectivity chapter, by the way, right, that the concept is not just buried in objectivity. First of all, we've shown that the concept is objective. That was the entailment from subjectivity into objectivity. We've now actually shown that objectivity is what it is by virtue of and at the behest of the concept itself. Is that?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that the truth in versus truth of is a helpful distinction as well.
Yeah. I always find I find myself falling into that language in Hegel because he uses it himself, right? So I always want to be wary of that. I mean, this is kind of, what you learn when you're reading Hegel. You want to capture the rigor of what he's saying without being beholden to the jargon by which he always says it. Because, sitting around talking to people about, well, this is the truth of that, and they're like, nothing's the truth of something else. Right? That doesn't make any sense. That's only Hegel world that maybe makes some sense of. And does it even really make sense to them? So I think these underlying issues, like you're bringing up, Kathleen, I think that's really where this stuff gets, that's where the rubber meets the road. Sorry, that's a metaphor. But that's really where these issues get joined. Tafik, I made you wait a long time. I apologize.
The question is, to what extent this precision of nature of the concept and its material truths necessarily leads to time being that concept itself? And if we are, and I think there is a line in the Absolute Knowing when Hegel says that truth is the concept itself, but then he didn't say that it represents itself to consciousness as empty intuition.
Yeah.
And if we are to stick to a logical nature of the process rather than temporal, how can we give any example of this kind of process? Because every example we can give it in a temporal way, like the life and sex and all of this, that life reproduces itself through us. You can only think of it in temporal ways.
Some kind of temporal matrix, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So I love that moment you're calling attention to in absolute knowing in the phenomenology, right? Because Hegel says there two things, right? One of which he says is, okay, we've reached absolute knowing. The concept is articulatable in purely this formalistic way now, which he does by saying, let me rehearse some of the phenomenology for you to show you what that is, right? Thanks a lot, Hegel. That doesn't really, I've read the book. I don't know how that really helps. But okay, maybe it does. And then he says, okay, now we've reached the concept on its own terms. And it can do two different things. One is it can present itself to consciousness again, but now always as the empty intuition, and we experience it through time. So the concept is time. Right? And then he says it's also nature. So that's the other line. So this is roughly setting up the system as Hegel envisioned it at that point in his career. He changed the way it's set up, but that's roughly it's set up. So I like it because both of those are addressing this kind of question about, okay, what if the concept just is this process, this movement? Is it something other than time? Is it something other than natural? Which for Hegel, go together, right? Because where do you find time for Hegel? In nature, right? That's the most fundamental, that's the most elementary form of time. There's richer forms of time along the way, but that's the most elementary form. And so Hegel would, I think, say this. Is it not possible to conceive of a process without temporality? The demonstration that that's possible, he would assert, is that we've been doing it throughout the logic. Your response, I think, among many other more sophisticated things you would say, would be, yeah, but we did that temporally. Right? We watched it unfold, literally, right? And Hegel's going to say at that point, yeah, right. Because to consciousness, this can only be a temporal process. So phenomenologically, the movement of the concept can only be temporal. he's full on board with that. He's good with that, right? But we're not dealing phenomenologically with it here. We're dealing with it as a process into itself. So without any kind of temporal markers, not yesterday, the next day, not the past, none of that stuff is here, right? Because the process can be thought of purely as an ontological movement without temporal demarcation. Now, can we think it that way? He says yes. Can we experience it that way phenomenologically? No. But we can think it that way.
But here's the distinction between things in themselves and things being presented.
So doesn't that give us the danger again of the phenomenal noumenal divide, right? We can think it this way, the noumenal, but phenomenally, it appears through time. So let me heighten that distinction just one bit more. Maybe this gives you more ammo. I don't know. We don't just think it this way; we know it this way. Now that's a violation of the Kantian stricture. Right? I can't know the noumenal. I can think it. In fact, I can think it because knowledge is restricted to what's experienceable. Right? So I can only think. See, Kant famously says, this is in the preface to the B edition in the footnote, right, where he says famously, I can think the noumenal, but what I ought to think about it comes from the demands of morality. In particular, I can think that I'm free, but I can also think that they're unicorns. Why does it matter? Unless I need to think something, right? The moral law requires me to think of myself in a certain way. So that's why the needs of the thinkable come from that. But here, the needs of the thinkable don't come from that. They come straight from the unfolding of the concepts themselves. So we have knowledge, not just thinkability. So I want to tread on or use that notion of thought here is not just the thinkable in the Kantian sense, but to think is to know, which is a violation of the Kantian stricture. So I don't think there's a reinstantiation of the noumenal phenomenal divine. That's the way I would put it. Which, I mean, your frustration is always the frustration with the logic. It tells us ultimately, if you buy what that passage says, that you must think of the idea not as a dead repose, but think of it as a process that engenders its own otherness and thereby comes to be itself, and through that engendering of its own otherness, it's othering of itself, it's negation of itself. Then you want to ask yourself immediately, does that have time embedded in it? His claim is no, it doesn't. Does it give rise to time? Absolutely it does. But it's not itself temporal.
So here's 2 points. That
Yeah.
logic is a prerequisite for both time and language, right?
Prerequisite?
Or not sure. A condition or
I'll go with the condition.
condition for both language and
The language thing we'll come back to explicitly, because he does in the preface to the 1831 edition, second edition. Logic. So we'll come back to that one explicitly, and we'll try to figure out the relationship between logic and language. He says that the logical forms are buried in language itself. We'll talk about what that means and what it could mean. But yes, your point still. I'm sorry.
okay.
So I don't mean to cut you off there. Did you want to say more about that?
No.
If there are conditions for.
Yeah, there are conditions for both time and
Yeah, I think that's right. That's the way Hegel thinks it. You can make the case back against Hegel, and maybe it's an internal critique. I'm never persuaded that it is, because I don't think it really works this way in Hegel. But I've seen many people try to make the claim that the logic lays out processional ontology that demands and can only be experienced. That's Hegel, but can only be even conceptualized. That's not temporal. But the rationale for that lies within Hegel's own claims about how temporality measures the negations that take place within space. And so that's the way to think about it. He has a non-subject dependent conception of temporality. So it's not, when he says it's the form of intuition, he's borrowing that obviously clearly from Kant, but it doesn't mean that it's a subjective form of intuition like it did in Kant, right? And so how does that work for him? It works in a very different way. It's part of the natural world itself. But how that works, that's another thing. But I've heard people try to make that argument to support this kind of view, that when he said that, just, you referenced it, and I think it's the power of that line where he says that the concept is time. I think that's where they're going. That's what they're trying to work from. That is. Yes, sorry, John.
Yeah, so I guess I wanted to just then ask, like, we keep talking about the sort of disappointing feeling at the end, and it was like, oh, it's all for this, and that we could say the truth is it's conformity or non-conformity to the immanent process of the concept.
Yep.
But then we don't know how to determine something's conformity or non-conformity. And so but at the same time, it seems like there's two different things going on in the text, where there's the immanent process, and then what I think we've been saying, or I see at least a lot of commentaries, Hegel breaking the immanence and pausing it and giving things which are not valid, like the free love concept, or he talks about labor a little bit.
Yeah.
And I'm just, I guess, wondering if maybe we are going too fast to dismiss it as non-immanent, and maybe there's less disappointment to be had.
Okay.
Because, like, I mean, I don't know, Hegel is saying it, right? And he never brackets it at any point.
Yeah.
And he continually, throughout the text, I think says things which at first glance look non-immanent.
Yeah.
But I guess I'm just questioning whether or not you think that's always the case. Yeah.
Well,
Does that make some sense?
I think there's moments in the text. The free love is a classic example of that. There are others as well, where Hegel will try to give you illustrations of what he's talking about, give you figurative language for what he's talked about, but they don't play a systematic role. They're not part of the demonstration itself. That's how I would distinguish them. So in that sense, and I grant that this, may be an insistence on the text rather than borne out straightforwardly from the text, that would then be, in my language, a polemical usage rather than a systematic usage of those figures, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I guess then I was just going to say, do you think then it still has anything to do with the relevancy of how we can determine or not determine a thing's conformity to its concept?
I think the conformity of something with its concept or not, its failure to be in its truth or to be in its truth. That whole project of doing that is predicated on elaborating what the concept is itself, in general, which is what the logic is, and then what it is specific to the domain in which you're operating. So if you're operating in the natural domain, what's the concept of nature qua the concept itself? What's the concept of spirit qua the concept itself if you're operating in the spirit? It matters whether you're looking at subjective spirit, absolute spirit, same thing in the natural domain. So it's not as though everything has to be measured back against the concept in itself. They're all ultimately going to be, as he just literally said, nothing is true unless it is in its truth the idea. I mean, so he's not like there's various different domains and how they all relate. I have no idea. His claim is that they all do relate. They are all expressions of the idea. They are all manifestations of the idea. But there are different levels of manifestation of the idea, right? So they have their own specificity. They have their own particularity, right, by virtue of that. And that's what you're really looking for. So when you say that, as he says a moment ago, one of the examples when he says the state is a true state or it's not a true state, well, you'd actually have to know what the concept of the state is, right? And he goes on to elaborate one, but that's what you would have to know. Similarly with the human life, right? He says it dissolves and it passes away, it dies when it becomes sick, but that's because the soul and the body have ceased to exist in reciprocal determination of one another. Well, that means you've actually worked out what the soul is, which is what the philosophy of subjective spirit is supposed to do, right? So all these things are massively difficult to the point of impossible at the level of, well, does it match up with the concept? At the most fundamental ontological level, of course they all have to match up. They have to be adequate to the concept. But their adequation to the concept is not, no, let me do it positively. Their adequation to the concept is always relevant to the particular domain in which you're operating. Right? So what do we mean by a natural organism is different than what we mean by a spiritual organism, for example. Is that
No, I think that's really
help at
helpful
all?
because I think some of the difficulty is also, I mean, as you said, like on a certain level, right? Everything, if it is true to
Yeah.
a certain extent.
Yeah.
And then
If it is at all,
Yes.
right? I mean, that's the ontological nature of it. It doesn't exist. It's nothing, right? Unless it bears the idea at least some level in it.
right.
So there is no state, right? Just to use that example again. There is no state. It doesn't even exist,
Sure.
right? Unless it is some way expressing the idea of state, whatever that is.
And not only that, but also on the most fundamental ontological level, there is no such thing as a violence, right? As well, everything is ultimately immanent at its core.
Isn't it the case, though, that there can be relations of violence within that immanence? And that's what extrinsic teleology is, right? One thing is being used at the behest of another. That's a violent imposition of one on the other. Now, it doesn't work unless there already is this power that has generated the other itself. I grant you that. So it's not
Yeah.
absolute intervention upon something that's wholly other and outside of it. So it's not that kind of violence. It's not an overthrow or overtaking of something, better said, of something outside it completely. I grant you that. So it's not Gewalt in that sense, right? It's not a complete violation of the other. It's another way of thinking about Gewalt. But it is nonetheless a kind of, there are moments of extrinsical relations within the immanent unfolding itself. So that's,
Yeah.
so it's not the radical violence of imposition and overthrow and violation. It is the violence of the usage of something for something else that is only possible by virtue of the fact that the otherness was itself generated out of the concept itself.
Mm.
That's about the best I can do with the Gewalt Macht problem
Yeah.
there in Hegel. He will even say, we'll come back to this in just a moment after the break, that logical life treats the mechanical and the chemical as expedients for its usage. And that is the kind of violence, right? It consumes them, it assimilates them. That's a violence, right? It's taking in, the organic's taking in the inorganic, is a simple way of putting it. Of course, the problems with that is, well, is that logical life or is that natural life? Or
Sure.
problems that we've talked about before. But that's an example for him, I think, of a violence that's violence within immanence itself.
Mm.
So there is violence there,
Okay.
but it's not the absolute violence of violation. Does that help?
That's really
Does
helpful.
that address that at all?
Yeah, yeah. And so then just to.
I'm not saying that solves all problems.
No, of
Please.
course not.
Nothing I say
It's
solves
helpful.
anything. But I think that's the account. That's true to the account of what he's getting.
Yeah, and then just to go back to what I was saying,
Yeah.
the logic is trying to give an account of the actual as that all actuality has to be to some extent in truth, and then all his other works to some extent are finding the concept within that domain and seeing whether or not it is adequate in its fullness.
I think that's true.
Okay.
I think the way to think about what's going on in each one of the domains is, what does it mean for something to be in its truth in the concept? That's the logic brief, right? 800 pages, but that's then you can then say with the project of the philosophy of nature is to say, what does it mean for something to be in its truth in nature? And there's various dimensions and levels of that. And then this finally is, what does it mean for something to be in its truth in spirit? There's subjective, objective, and absolute variations in that. So that to me is what the projects of each one of those sections of the encyclopedia of sciences, philosophical sciences, that's each one of those, what each one of those domains are really about finding the truth of something in its truth as natural, in its truth as spiritual, and in its truth as logical is distinct from that, those things. So that's
really helpful.
does that make some sense of that at all?
Yeah.
And the claim is that obviously, I mean, that's what this big claim is about the idea, is that the natural and the spiritual exist at all to the extent that they have the idea. That they are the idea.
Okay.
Yeah, is that
That's really helpful. Yeah, thank you.
good too? Sorry.
This conversation about the different areas and then also going back to the two different ways of starting the logic makes me feel like the three syllogisms at the end of the encyclopedia are really relevant here. And I guess I have a question on so few related questions. One is the phenomenology is the spirit part, the first term in the third syllogism of philosophy,
Not the phenomenology,
not the phenomenology.
the philosophy of
The
spirit,
philosophy of spirit.
Yeah. which incorporates a section called phenomenology,
Yes.
which is not the book.
but that's I guess what I guess what I'm confused about is how is it that it's like the relationship between the phenomenology of spirit and the philosophy of spirit is strange. Like they're not really two separate things. It's like one of them just hasn't realized it's involved in the philosophy of spirit, just not it's not philosophical. Or is the philosophy of spirit is the phenomenology of spirit part of the syllogism of cognition then? Like what's
No, I read the phenomenology this way. This is controversial what I'm about to say. A lot of scholars disagree about what I'm about to say, so please go into this with it. Hegel scholars to this day deliberate about this, right? We fight and argue amongst ourselves. Who else would care about this? About this sort of matter. But I'm one of those who thinks the phenomenology is a preparatory work for entry into the encyclopedia system. So it's an epistemological project preparing you for ontological knowledge. So its question is, by what right do we have absolute knowing? It's trying to, in those terms, its project, its enterprise is to do the critique of pure reason question, the quid juris question, by what right do you have this knowledge, and show that we have the right to have knowledge of things as they are in their truth, absolute, in itself, not for us, but in itself, precisely what concept we couldn't have. So this is the phenomenology. This is Hegel's project of showing that if you really push critique fully through, it breaks through its own strictures of phenomenal noumenal divide, which Kant dogmatically insisted upon and shouldn't have. He gave us the critical project. He should have pushed the critical project all the way through. If he had, you would have forms of consciousness that would break through into shapes of worlds, which is roughly what the phenomenology does, and then those shapes of world would end up with a process that actually bears out what the world is, which is the movement of the concept, right? Spirit. That's preparatory to then leading you into, to start off with now, into this encyclopedia system itself, which the logic is the first moment thereof. So then when you get back to what he calls phenomenology in the system itself, it's not got that epistemological project there, right? It's not trying to justify absolute knowing. Absolute knowing has already been justified. You're doing it. So here you want to give absolute knowing of what it means for things to appear to consciousness. And there he gives an account of the, let me say broadly, the mental apparatuses by which representations take place, which is not the project in the phenomenology. Right there, it's about investigating those representations. Here, and the particularities thereof and what they entail and all that kind of stuff from them. There, it's just, how do you have them in the first place? It's quite a different question. It's an ontological question, not an epistemological question. Is that?
Yes, but it then makes me question the way that I'm maybe misunderstanding how you're talking about the three syllogisms there then, because I take all of that, and that seems correct to me, but it also seems that all of that is taking place under the general perspective of the syllogism of philosophy, not it seems like the syllogism of being, syllogism of cognition, syllogism of philosophy. Only the latter one really is philosophy as philosophy.
Yep.
So the other two, those are not those are before the entrance into the encyclopedia. So I mean, the encyclopedia is philosophical work, not.
I take him, what he's saying with those three syllogisms at the end of the encyclopedia, when I take him to say, broadly speaking, there's a lot more detail about it, obviously, than what I'm about to say. But broadly speaking, what he's saying about those is, look, there's three ways you can read the system. you can read it sequentially and linearly. Go from logic to nature to spirit. That's the syllogism, as he calls it, of being. And why he calls it being is that's the way it just shows up. One thing follows from another, follows from another. So it's immanent deduction, it's retrogressive grounding, it's all the stuff we talked about. The logic comes first because it's ultimately in telling that it has to be concretized in various sorts of ways, borne out in sort of ways that ultimately are in the nature and in spirit. But then he says, so that's the first way.
To briefly interrupt, is that a philosophical telling?
I think that is I don't know if I would call it a philosophical because he wants to reserve the philosophical for the last one.
Yes.
But is it valid philosophically?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is it what philosophy ultimately demands of us? No. Then the syllogism of cognition starts off with nature first, right? Then spirit, then logic last. Why? Because you start off with the natural world, which we're all embedded in and live within, and we cognize about it. That's what the spirit section is. So here's why the phenomenology, in that sense, in the subjective spirit section, is about grafting in or taking in all that, and it's about different things than objective spirit. But subjective spirit's about learning and taking that stuff in, and then seeing how it's fits under the logical categories last, right? So this is all about really how those are instantiations of the logical categories. That's the syllogism of cognition. The last syllogism is about how the logic actually gives rise to the other two moments. That's the philosophical one because you don't see that one on your way through, right? When you're reading sequentially, when you're reading through, you go, okay, this follows, okay, logic gives rise to nature, nature gives rise to spirit, spirit's the end, there you go. And what he's saying at the end of spirit is, well, wait a minute, back up now. Now that you've completed this trajectory all the way through linearly, you got to go back and say, well, how did I come into possession of this knowledge? That's the syllogism of cognition. How do I come to have these sets of principles and these sets of concepts and these theorems in this way? But then, is that the philosophical reading, the cognitive reading? No, because that's empirical acquisition questions. He calls it the logic of discovery for that reason. But in the final one, the final syllogism, the syllogism of philosophy, he wants to say the logic is the middle term that gives rise to both the singular, the major and the minor terms, the singular and the particular. And at that moment, you can say, well, okay, wait a minute. The logic doesn't just come first, it doesn't come last, it comes middle, not because it's the transition point between the other two, but because it actually engenders both the other disjunctive syllogism. So it gives rise to the other two. That's the key, and what that means and how that works, whole other thing to talk about. But that's the truly philosophical reading of the system. But I think Hegel's point there is that you can't get to that one until you pass through the other two.
Well, absolutely. I guess maybe we're talking past each other, maybe not, but on what's counting as philosophy versus maybe what's counting as something else. Because just to throw out almost certainly inaccurate terms, it seems like the syllogism of being is describing something kind of like a science, and the syllogism of cognition is, this is like disciplinary bias, is something like psychoanalysis, and then the syllogism of philosophy is philosophy. And I know those are different ways of approaching. I know that's.
So I would use slightly different language. We'll take a break after this. Slightly different language. I would say the first syllogism is an ontology.
Okay.
That's why it's a syllogism of being, right? It's just an ontology. It's how these things ontologically entail one another. The syllogism of cognition is an epistemological reading of the system. How do we come to acquire knowledge of these things? And then the final one is the truly philosophical. Okay, so what does it mean to read nature as produced by the concept? Spirit as produced by the concept, rather than as the concretation of, right? But as literally produced of, right? The manifestation of, which is the language he uses at that point. It's not an appearance there, it's literally a manifestation of it. That's the struggle for what a genuinely philosophical reading of the science would be. That's the task. All right, so we're at 450. Let's call it 450. Back at 5. Right?